All right. Let's see here. So what I want to talk about today is depth. So I'm looking at what you guys are doing in this project and what I've shown you so far. One of the things that I'm really noticing in a lot of the projects is a lack of depth. And I don't just mean background and foreground elements. And I've been, standing over your shoulders and saying, okay, you need a little bit more, you need another layer of this, or you need another layer of that. And that's all well and good. But what you're creating right now as far as the individual shapes is concerned is basically all very flat. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to show you how to create objects that are a little bit more three-dimensional. And I'm going to show you two ways of doing that. One's a little easier than the other, and the other one's a little more conventional, and the harder way is more the way I gravitate towards. But, well, you'll just see. So all I'm going to do is let me just take a, let's just take a nice blue here. I want like a nice medium blue, and I'm going to create two circles. So I'm just going to create a nice perfect circle here. So there I've got a nice circle. And I'm just going to duplicate it so that I have two identical circles so that we can really see the difference between them once I start doing the different techniques. The first thing that I want to show you is whenever you have a shape, any layer, and you double click, and when you double click, don't double click on the text or else it's going to ask you just to change the name. Don't double click on the color because then it asks you to change the color. Double click over to the right of the text here, and you're going to get these things called layer styles. And layer styles are really cool. Layer styles are a whole series of things that you can do to a layer to, just jazz it up a little bit, I guess. And they're pretty cool. Let me just show you the first one that you can do, and especially related to what I was talking about a little earlier, and that is creating a sense of depth, is the drop shadow. Now, one thing that I want to caution you about layer styles is I can turn on a layer style without actually seeing the options change. So here I have the basic layer styles, okay? Blend mode, opacity, things that I can actually change right out here in the layers menu. However, I don't necessarily want to do that. I want to change my drop shadow. Well, why don't I have any options for drop shadow here? Well, the reason is because I haven't clicked on the drop shadow. See, it's not highlighted blue yet. So that's my first thing that I would tell you is you can check these and turn them on and yet not see your options. You have to actually click on the words to get to your options for drop shadow. And if we zoom in here, you can kind of see already, I do have a little bit of a drop shadow on our first circle here. And as I start to change it a little bit more, you'll see how it starts to define itself. So your three major options here, well, there's four major options here, is the opacity, the distance, the spread, the size, as well as the angle and the blend mode. Usually putting the blend mode on multiply, which is what its default is usually what you want to keep it on, but not necessarily all the time. To make it more stand out a little bit more, I'm going to just increase the distance right now, and you can see how the shadow is getting further away from our object, right? What does that do to the perceived depth of our image? It makes it look like what? Yeah, it makes it look like the object is popped out more, or in other words, is further away from our piece of paper. Paper being in quotes, of course, from our background. Maybe that's a better way of putting it, from our background. And I'm going to say this a couple times tonight or today, but this is why I make you draw, too, is some people might not know that instinctively. But as you guys are sketching, these are the types of things that you should see. The other thing is, whether a shadow has a hard edge like it is right now, or as I increase the size, you can see how the edge starts to get slightly fuzzy. That basically talks about, where the light is, how far away the shadow is from its object. So by increasing the distance between the shadow and the object and changing the edge of the shadow, I can make an object look like it's further away from the background. Now, of course, that's all an illusion because this is all two-dimensional. But it's really important to understand that we have that ability to create that illusion just simply by sliding these little sliders. The spread actually increases the width, or the actual spread, like how much the shadow spreads out. Okay, and usually 90% of the time you're going to want to keep that down towards the bottom most of the time. The angle, it does exactly what you think it does, is it changes the angle of the drop shadow. One thing to note here is you have what they call a global light, and that global light will affect all the drop shadows in your image. So if you have drop shadows on multiple layers and they have this global light checked, if I then go and change this, then all the layers with drop shadows will change the angle. Okay, so that's really important to kind of keep in mind. So if you have the global light turned on, okay, you're going to want to be careful, because if you start playing with this angle too much, it will change everything. If you uncheck that box, now you can switch the angle around of the drop shadow, and it won't change the drop shadow of any other objects that might be on the page. And I'll show you a good example of this in a little bit. So we've got our global light, that's good, distance, spread, size, that sort of stuff. We can also talk about the contour of the thing, of the shadow, which is kind of interesting, so you can really play with it. But most of the time, 99% of the time, you just want to stay like that, right on the regular slanted. So an anti-alias, basically, if you check that, that makes the transition smoother between gray to dark and so on and so forth. It increases the quality of your shadow and of the smoothness. That's a good thing to have checked on. But if you have a ton of those, it can really use a lot of processor power, and the computer can kind of slow down a little bit. So, you know, most of the time, honestly, anti-aliased off is usually pretty darn good anyway. But it's never a bad idea to have it turned on anyway. So, okay. So that helps us kind of define our shape against the edge. However, the shape itself is still rather flat. Now you can go and you can play with a whole bunch of these. By the way, did you notice the stroke is down here at the bottom? Some people had asked me, where's the stroke? Because you guys are used to Illustrator and the stroke is right out there in the toolbox. Well, here it's not. Well, it's in the layer styles. So there I can set the stroke on an object and put a border around it. In this case, it looks kind of stupid, so we're not going to use it. But that's where it is, by the way. It's in these layer styles. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check bevel and emboss. Okay, and bevel and emboss makes it look, let's see here, let's increase the size as well as the depth here. There we go. Gives our object a three-dimensional look. And again, this is tied to our global light. By increasing the size, it increases, you know, the size of the bevel along the edge. The softness increases this edge right here, how sharp it is versus how soft it is. It's really not doing much right now. You can change a whole bunch of stuff. Embossing makes a different look. It looks like it's actually part of something that's not working very well here. You know, you can kind of play with a pillow emboss, makes it look like it's dropping in and then coming back out. So if I had this on a background color, it would look a lot better right now, but I don't. There's all sorts of really cool things, so that's not working at all. But you know, an inner bevel is usually the best for that. Outer bevel puts the beveled stuff on the outside. So again, if we had a background color here instead of just transparent, it would probably look a little bit better. But for our purposes, inner bevel is probably the best. And you can you know, make it look like it's raised up or pushed down. And then again, notice how the highlight now, if the light's coming from the left side, top left, if it's pushed down, our highlight would be on the inside where the lip comes back up to the surface right here. And this is where our drop shadow would not work very well now. Okay? And again, it's better if we have a background color. But if we have the direction going up, now our highlight's on the side because the light's coming down. It's going to hit our highlight here and then cast a shadow down here. So now we have a shape that's starting to look a little bit more three-dimensional. The other thing that we can play with here is the angle of the light. Global light is on, so if I start changing the angle of this, you'll notice that my drop shadow moves with it, which is usually what you want. Oh, it's not letting me undo that. That's rather annoying. Anyway, and anti-aliasing on helps smooth it again. The contour also helps things, changes things a little bit. This is basically like a cross section of the shape. So if you were to slice it this way and then look at it from the side, this is how the shape would look, the edge would look. So here it's just a straight slant up like a hill. Here it kind of curves. Here it goes up and then back down and then back up, and then here's doubles. And so each one of these kind of changes how the light is going to hit our object. Most of the time when you use bevel and emboss, which is to create a button for a website or something like that, you're going to use just a simple slant. Notice also it's really, really hard to make this look like a ball. So if you wanted to make this look like a sphere, it's not going to happen. You can increase the size all the way, you know. It's still going to look flat on the edge. And that's because bevel and emboss isn't about making it look round. It's about giving it an edge. If you want to make something look like a sphere, you're going to have to do that by hand, which I'm going to show you on the second circle. The last thing about bevel and emboss is you also have the highlight modes. If you want your highlights to be a little bit stronger, a little bit brighter, more of a pure white to make it look more reflective, take it off of screen and then pump the opacity all the way up. And you can see how it really goes pure white now. You don't see any of the blue color through it. That basically means that what I'm doing is if I put it on screen and I take the opacity down, okay, what this is saying is this object is made of blue plastic and it's a little shiny, but not really shiny. But if you want it to look like highly polished, so that it has not necessarily a highlight, but more like a reflection, you want to push the opacity all the way up and set it to normal so you don't see any color inside that white there. That basically is saying this is a reflection, not even a highlight, it's a reflection, a specular highlight on here, and this is a really shiny piece of plastic or a blue piece of glass, something like that. And you can do the same thing with the shadow mode. Take it off of normal, and then if I increase the opacity, you see how it gets much, much darker and goes to a pure black here. Most of the time, the defaults are going to be what you want them to be, and then you can really just play with the opacity to kind of give it a sense of how bright you want that highlight to look. Does that make sense? There's also a couple options under here, contour, where again you can kind of change the contour of the side of the object and it gives you a range. So you can set it closer to the edge, further away from the edge, that sort of thing, which is kind of cool. And then there's also a texture. I hate this usually, but you can put a texture into the object. You can scale the texture up or down, okay? And you can also increase or decrease the depth, okay, to make it a little bit more or less noticeable. So I can kind of make it have a little bit of texture. The problem with this is if you're really trying to make something look three-dimensional, the texture does not warp with the shape, doesn't twist and turn like it would on a real shape. So it's usually only good for flat objects anyway. And it's also repetitive. So you can see that repeated shape over and over and over and over again. And especially as you take the scale down, you can see it. It's like wallpaper on a website. And usually that's pretty hideous. And in this case, it's pretty hideous. So I generally don't like them. I don't want you to use them if you don't have to, that sort of thing. You can also invert it so the whites become blacks and the blacks become whites, whatever. Okay? But again, no big deal. All these other things you can play with, although I will show you the gradient overlay is pretty cool. And watch how this works. If I check this on, you can see how it just puts this black and white gradient over top of the color. But if I take the blend mode and I change it to, let's say, like an overlay, maybe a screen, nope, it's just a darken, nope, Multiply. Yeah, multiply will work probably the best. And I change the angle of this to match the angle of my light. So my light's coming from the left, top left. And then I kind of make it a little less opaque. So I take the opacity of this gradient overlay down. Now it's really taking this button and it's giving it an even more 3D effect, because now it feels like the light is hitting the corner and then coming down and falling off and then going to the beveled edge. So by using the gradient overlay to kind of create almost like a shadow, a fade out effect, I really can make this button look very three-dimensional. So essentially, just by using these three things, just click OK, take a look at our button here. It's really got a much better feel than the one below it. See that? I mean, that's huge. It's much more three-dimensional. It's got more depth. It stands out more. It's got more contrast. It's just going to call your attention. This just looks like paper thin. So now, let's say that I wanted to paint this to make it look like a sphere. I've already shown you that I really can't do that with the bevel and emboss or anything like that. So instead, I'm going to have to do it by hand. Before I do that, by the way, one real quick thing. Notice your list of special effects now are listed, the layer styles are listed underneath the shape. If you have a bunch of layers in your layers palette, it really takes up a lot of space. You can just close them by hitting that little arrow. And notice that any layer that has layer effects will have a little FX symbol on the right and a little arrow here that you can open up or collapse the list of special effects that you have. And that really doesn't matter if you've only got 2 layers, but when you've got 20 or 30 or 50, it can be really annoying to see them all. You just collapse them and then it's much easier. Okay. So now I'm going to take this and let's just say, oh yeah.
If you were to duplicate it from that, would it come out the same layer?
Right, so yes, that's a good point. And I was actually going to deal with that in a minute or two. But yes, if I right click and duplicate the layer now the special effects come with it. Okay? And that can be really handy, because let's say you wanted a design where you wanted 4 or 5 of these circles. Maybe they're even different sizes. If you're smart, you'll do one of them, get it looking perfect, and then you'll duplicate it 4 more times. Now you've got 5 circles that are all identical, and then you can start changing the size or moving them around, whatever you want to do. So it's always good to try and think ahead when you're doing a design, because it will save you a lot of time. But if you don't do that, I'll show you something in a minute that you can do to help that out. In fact, let's just duplicate this layer one more time, the plain one. I'm going to duplicate this plain layer, and we'll just put it over here for the time being so I can show you. Let's just turn it off. So let's say I wanted to take this one and I wanted to make it look like a ball. I want to make it look like a sphere. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go over to my colors, and my idea is I want to paint black and white over top of this. So I'm using black to create shades and white to create tints of the same color. Now the negative to what I'm doing here is, the way I'm going to show you to do it at least, I'm going to be painting directly onto the layer. So once I start this, if I don't like the job I've done, I have to start all over again essentially. Okay? There are ways to do it on a separate layer, but they're kind of difficult actually, so I just find it's easier to do it on here. And I'll usually make a copy of a layer when I'm about to do something like this, so that if I mess up, I just trash it and then start with the copy again, right? I mean, it just makes sense. So I'll just make a copy like I did, turn it off, and there I go. So I'm going to go over here to my colors, and you can see the colors here, and then there's this button right here. I'm going to click that, and it's going to go back to black and white, black for my foreground and white for my background. And I'm going to use this little arrow button to flip-flop them when I need to get to the other one. So when I start doing my shadows, I'll be on black. When I start to do my highlights, I'll flip-flop them and I'll go to white. Just that easy. A lot of times, even if I'm painting with colors, I'll set up Photoshop with my 2 colors like that so that I have it. Next, what we're going to do is we're going to go to our brush tool. And then up here, you want to take your opacity, which will usually be way up high, and you want to bring it down. Maybe 15%. 20%, something like that. Okay, there's a lot of options here. You can play with the flow. Here it says tablet pressure controls. Okay, if we had tablets, which we do have a couple of them, you could plug that in, but we're not going to have that for now. So I'm going to, it doesn't matter because one's not plugged in, so it's not going to do anything anyway. And then the most important thing here is I like a bigger size brush, but you need to make sure the hardness is set all the way down to 0. What that does is it gives us a very soft-edged brush. We want soft for this process. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and I'm going to paint on my layer. Why does it have a no symbol on it? Thank you. It's not a rasterized layer. So when I click on it, it's going to say, this shape layer needs to be rasterized before proceeding. It will no longer have a vector mask. Rasterize a shape, and in this case, it's the only way that I can do what I want to do. So I'm going to click OK. When I click OK, is this shape now scalable? Can I scale it up later? Not without loss of quality. I showed you that in a previous demo, if you remember. So now I'm going to click that and watch the layer over here. Watch what happens to it. Boom. You get rid of the layer. It gets rid of the layer mask, the mask, and it gets rid of the colors icon that you see here. And now it's just a pixel-based layer. So now I'm going to take my brush, low opacity, soft edge brush, and I'm going to start painting just along the edges. Uh-oh. Well, it's starting to look good on the shape, but what's my problem that I'm getting into here? What's happening that I probably don't want to have happen? Come on, it's pretty obvious. What's that? Yeah, I'm also painting the background at the same time. I only want to paint on the object. Now, I could continue and then try and get rid of it later, but that would just be a mess. So what I'm going to do is let me step backwards here a couple times and get rid of everything. Okay, so now I just rasterized my layer. I'm right-click and rasterize it now. So what I'm going to do is over here in the Layers palette, there's a really cool little button right here. This is Lock Transparent Pixels. I'm going to click that. See how it's darkened now. And now whenever I paint, it doesn't go on the background. It only allows you to add colors where there are already colors. Anything that's transparent stays transparent. It's a very, very handy little tool. So I'm actually going to make my brush a little bit bigger by hitting the bracket tool. And notice I'm just going to be using the edge of the brush here. And I'm very slowly, using a bunch of clicks, going to keep adding my shadows. I am going to add a little bit on the top here. Just ever so slightly. And now I'm going to go back down to the bottom and I'm just going to keep making it darker. Now I'm going to take my opacity from 15 down to like 5. I'm going to go a little bit more in the bottom right-hand corner here and just darken it out. Already starting to look pretty good, isn't it? Not too shabby. Now, what do I need? The highlight, exactly. With a sphere, your highlight is most likely not going to be at the top edge here. Usually when we, especially, just stereotypically when you draw a sphere, your highlight's going to be right up on the top quarter. So that's why I darken the edges a little bit, because a ball is actually going away from you on all the edges. And so the easiest way to show that is to darken the edges a little bit, even on the top where it's closest to the light. You're still going to have a slight change in tone back here because it's still going away from the viewer. In real life, it might not even do that, but at the same time, when you're talking about illustrating that process, it's a good idea. So now I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to flip-flop my black and my white colors. I'm going to go back here, and I'm going to get a slightly smaller brush, and I'm going to stay around 10%, seems to work for me. And I'm just going to slowly start clicking on the highlights here. And again, multiple clicks works really well. And I'm going to concentrate a little bit more in the center here, and then go out a little bit. Let's go even lighter back again, so like 3 or 4% helps me out here. Just kind of spreads it out a little bit. And then a lot of times what I'll just start doing is I'll just very carefully, slowly start considering how bright I want that highlight to look. That looks pretty good. I'll probably stop there, but I could continue to make it brighter. But you get the idea. Now I've got this three-dimensional sphere, okay, that really looks relatively round. Again, now I've got something that has a little extra depth. If I were to go back on this, I think my shadow's a little light. I could probably make the highlight a little bit more. The highlight is a lot brighter on the projector than it is on my screen. The projector has horrible contrast that you guys are looking at. So yeah, you guys can all see it. Okay. So I would probably go back in with the black here, get a little bit of a bigger brush, and start making the black even more noticeable. Take the opacity up a little bit. And notice I'm not even really painting on the object. With a really soft edge brush, it actually puts tone down in an area that's wider than the circle shows you. So I can sit here and just brush the edge, and it will still put more dark, more black in there. I'm not painting with the actual brush, especially for the shadows here. Now I'm starting to get what I like, and I'll go in to grow the shadow up the side. That's better. Make it a little darker up along the top here. There we go. So, you know, it takes some experience. Guys, this is why I make you do sketches, even in a computer design course. This is why you've got to draw your sketches. You will not know how to do this. You wouldn't even know that you should do this unless you have spent time drawing and looking at the way light falls on objects. This is really important, your understanding of light, because light defines form. I cannot emphasize this enough, and I will say that again. Light defines form. So if you are trying to show something's form, its shape in three-dimensional space, you have got to understand how the light falls on an object. And if you can't draw it on paper, chances are 9 out of 10 you can't do it in the computer either. So if you, and beyond that, you won't even know that you should. So when I go through this process with students, I'll have a lot of students who would look at the flat blue shape without any of its effects and just say, that's good enough. When in reality, they really need that three-dimensional shape to it. And it's even just understanding that you need to do that. That understanding is something that comes from your ability to see light, understand what something is supposed to look like. Now, last little lesson. And this goes back to when you were talking about duplicating objects. Let's say I've forgotten that I had to duplicate stuff beforehand, and I created a bunch of circles, and I like the way this circle is done. So I like the layer effects on it, and I want the layer effects on this one too. Okay? You can drag and drop layer effects from one layer to another, which is really cool. So all I've got to do is go over here to my layers palette and hold the Option key down and drag the effects into the next layer. And they copy. Now, be careful. If you don't hold the Option key down, it doesn't copy them, it just moves them. So now they drop off of this object and then they pop into this one. So you've got to have the Option key held down. You can also copy individual effects. So for instance, let's say I like my sphere, I like the two buttons. What I really want, though, is I want that drop shadow, and I want exactly the same drop shadow. Well, I could go into the layer effects, click on the drop shadow, and memorize all the numbers. Or, much easier than that, grab the drop shadow that's in the list here. See that? Option drag just that one onto our shape, and now you can see it's got the exact same drop shadow as all the others. Now, one other thing, just to illustrate it, global lighting. If I go and I change the global light, notice it changes on all the objects. So when you have global light set up, it will change everything for every object that has that checked in the layer options. So be very careful when you start messing around with the global light, because it will change everything. Does that make sense? So those are layer styles, creating three-dimensional shapes. Realize there are limitations, especially to the bevel and emboss. If you want to make something look like a sphere, you know, or something that's a little more organic, a little more round, chances are you're going to have to do it on your own. If you're going to do that, don't forget the lock transparency button up here. That's huge. That's a huge one, and everybody forgets it. Any questions? All right.